Hi and welcome. My name is Boglarka Eliz Varga, and I am a printmaking graduate from Camberwell, UAL. And I initiated this event because I am interested how motherhood affects and shapes artistic practice. Being visible or invisible in the artworks or in the subject matter. Beside this, I also noticed this fine line between the two identities, the mother and an artist, being narrow by living rooms turned into studios and workshop time limited by the child's nap. The reduced or the lack of childcare during the pandemic of COVID-19 and lockdown. I am feeling really honored, and I think I'm very lucky that Klea McKenna accepted my invitation and created this beautiful and honest talk on the intersection of motherhood with art practice based on her own experience and observations. I would like to highlight Klea's most recent work called Gestures in Quarantine, which began as an experiment in how to make photographic art while at home with two small children during San Francisco's shelter-in-place order. She began making cameraless photographs called photograms on the roof of her apartment using the limited materials available to her and the fading effect that sunlight and time inflicted on fugitive ink colors using the old handkerchief as negatives. So I'm inviting you to watch with me this video, and yeah, and hope you will enjoy it as much as I enjoyed. I already seen it. And do please stay for the little talk afterwards.
Hello, I'm Klea McKenna. I'm a visual artist. I live in San Francisco, and I was invited to give this talk by Boglarka Varga, and she asked me to give an artist talk, which I do that a lot, but she asked me specifically to talk about the intersection of motherhood with art practice, both for myself and in my own art practice, as well as my observations or thoughts about it. And it's something that I think about a lot, but I don't often talk about as much as I would like, because as any artist mom knows, or any professional mom of any sort knows, we often have to kind of compartmentalize our identities. And when I'm in the art world talking about my artwork, I have to kind of be conscious of the way in which foregrounding my role as a mom has different effects on different people. So I think we all are kind of taught and have the habit of sort of pushing that to the background and putting our professional selves first, and not necessarily focusing on how much those two things affect each other. So I agreed to do this talk because I thought an opportunity to weave those two identities together and kind of look at how they affect each other. And that's something I've been doing in my private life and within my own community for the last 6 years since I became a mom. But I'm still figuring out how to talk about it publicly. So, like I said, my name is Klea McKenna. I'm a visual artist, primarily working with photographic media, but not exclusively, also film and sculpture a bit. I live here in San Francisco. I'm in my home right now. My baby just went down for a nap, and I'm hoping he stays asleep for long enough for me to do this. And so I'm going to kind of start just by talking about my personal experience with motherhood, and then lead into the work I've made in the last 6 years during that time. So I'm going to go to screen share and show you some images. Let's see if we can do this. No, that's not the one I want. Well, this one. There we go. Okay. Hopefully you can see that. So when I think about my art practice and kind of the different bodies of work, everything is sort of pre-Fiona and post-Fiona. Fiona's my first child. She's 6. She's about to turn 6 now. And that's partly because that's just a timeline of my life, but it's also because my relationship to the work really did change at that time. So when she was born, I had just wrapped up a body of work, and I thought that was really smart to like finish something, have a big show right before I had the baby. It turns out that it would have been a better idea to sort of leave some open threads for me to follow, because having to kind of reinvent my art practice, find a new direction, a new body of work at the same moment as having this new identity was a really challenging time. And so my experience of it was somewhat unique, but also I think surprisingly common. I had postpartum depression and anxiety after my first child. And despite thinking that I kind of was very vigilant about those sort of issues, it went basically undiagnosed for 10 months. And so I had a very, very difficult first year. And the way that that manifested for me had a lot of effects on, you know, my parenting and my personal relationships, but the way it manifested in my art practice is that it just completely decimated my confidence in my own voice. And I think that that's often how postpartum depression and anxiety and even other mental health issues can affect creative people, is that, I lost the ability to take risks, to trust my own instincts creatively. And that was alarming to me, because that was something that I knew was absolutely key to making my work. And I think we all know, any writer or artist or anyone knows that lack of confidence is sort of the enemy of creativity, right? If you can't make freely because there's this voice in your head constantly telling you that everything you're making isn't worth making, that's paralyzing. So this is just I'm just going to show a few images of myself with my work and my kids, and as I lead into talking about the actual work. So this one's obviously later, once I'm pregnant with my son. That's my daughter next to me. So the part of this that was really interesting to me is, as I said, I went about 10 months in that state, and then I finally got kind of the diagnosis and the help that I needed, and quite quickly came out of it and kind of re-entered my art practice then. And as it went on into that following year, it became clear to me that something had shifted. Not only had I regained my confidence, I felt that I had regained it stronger than I had ever had it before. And more importantly, but also more perplexing, was I felt plugged into my creative source in a way that I had never felt prior to having kids. I had always felt that I was sort of circling the thing that I was trying to say, or circling around like the core of my work, but not quite hitting it exactly. And after I had children and kind of found my way back into making work, I felt like I was just had like a direct, like I literally felt like I had plugged it into the source, and I had a direct relationship to what I was trying to do with my work and what I was trying to say, and I had the confidence to do it. And that has really changed things for me. So the last 5 years have been, despite all the practical, here's a more recent picture, despite all the kind of practical obstacles of being a working mom, not having nearly as much time to make work, I have actually been more productive than I ever was before, and kind of more, and I think the work has been stronger also. And so this is something that I'm really interested in, and I wish there were like studies on it. Of course, this isn't a topic that there are large studies on, but I'm really interested to explore how other moms in creative industries and other artists, writers, women who make their living from their own creativity, how they experience this. And I'm curious how much this shift for me is related to motherhood versus related to the kind of trauma of postpartum depression. I've recently learned about something called post-traumatic growth, which is sort of the flip side of post-traumatic stress, right? And it's something that not everyone who has post-traumatic stress or has a traumatic experience has, but some people have a kind of burst of growth afterwards. And I think the more I learn about it, I think that's what happened with me. My questions are, how much, could that have happened had I had some other kind of trauma that wasn't related to motherhood? How much is it connected to motherhood? How much is it connected to my entrance to motherhood being a traumatic experience? Because it had been smooth sailing, I wouldn't have had this shift. And just kind of in a larger picture, I'm very interested to try to understand more, how does this shift of identity and lifestyle change a woman's intellect and change how they are able to translate ideas into, object or text or something materialized? So it's something that I'm pondering how to explore that more. I'm thinking of creating a survey that I can kind of disseminate to artist moms and kind of gather a larger field of information. And really I'm just wondering if other women have experienced this thing of kind of connecting more deeply to their source. My mom said an interesting thing when I first had my daughter. She said that kind of you think that you're swimming, but then when you have children, you realize you were only wading. And having children is kind of the moment of like stepping off the edge into deep water in terms of just the intensity of emotional life, I think was what she was referring to. Another quote that's been a real guiding light for me is Pina Bausch, the choreographer, Pina Bausch, who's one of my absolute favorite artists. She said, fragility is also your strength. And I've always connected to that quote, but I think after going through that experience and really kind of coming face to face with my own fragility in a way, I understood it a lot better. And it's something I return to when I feel unsure of what I'm doing, is use what you feel to be fragile inside you, use it. And that will actually make your work stronger. Yeah. So this is me quite recently with my daughter and my son, who is now 10 months old. Okay, so now I'm going to go back. I'm going to talk about the artwork, and I'm going to go back to the moment kind of right after I had my first child and work forward from there. So at the time, I had a studio at the Headland Center for the Arts, which is a wonderful arts organization in the Bay Area. It's on decommissioned military land, and it's right on the cliffs above the Pacific Ocean. So it's very kind of beautiful and bleak and rugged, and the artist studios are in all these old military buildings. I was working there, and for about a decade prior to this, I had been working almost exclusively with photograms, which is a direct light to paper process. It's an analog photographic process, but that doesn't use a camera or a negative, and therefore is not reproducible. It's just like light on paper. And there's a lot of forms of photograms. You're probably familiar with ones more like Man Ray kind of explored that, and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, and those kind of photograms tend to use silhouettes of objects. So I had been working in that tradition and experimenting with it for a long time. And at this point, right after I had my daughter, I had this idea in my mind for a while about rubbings, but I wasn't sure how to utilize it. And so I took basically what this process is, and these are process shots. I show a lot of process shots. I would take analog photographic paper, like black and white, gelatin silver paper, go out at night and hand emboss it into textures in the landscape. In this case, these are cracks in cliffs, in rock, but also in the cement of these old battery buildings, these kind of military structures that range from the early 1800s through World War II. They were meant to hold these giant cannons and guns, and they're all there in the landscape, but they're kind of crumbling and decaying. And so I would go out at night on nights when there was not too much moonlight, and I would hand emboss in darkness the paper into these textures, and then take it into the darkroom the next day and cast light across it. And so this was a way of making photograms, cameraless photographs, but making them, rather than using the silhouettes and the shadows of objects, I was using texture, pressure, the labor and pressure of my own body on the photographic material. And let's see what's next. Oh, this is a large installation of them kind of pieced together. This is called the Weeping Rocks. So when the paper becomes embossed, it's very subtle. It's about as much depth as like letterpress printing, right? But there's no ink, no image. And then when the light casts across it, it's those little raised hills and valleys that catch the light or cast tiny shadows, and that creates the image. And then I develop it in, traditional wet chemistry. So that's a little explanation of the technique. And this is not really an existing technique. This was sort of my own innovation with the material. And it took about 6 months to work out the technical aspects of making this actually work and make a compelling image. There's a close-up. You can see a lot of people say this looks like the surface of the moon. That's true. I mean, that's texture, but that's also because we always see the moon side lit. And when we see, well, not always, but when we see the texture on the moon, we see it side lit. And so we think of things that are deeply side lit as being kind of lunar. These are more process shots. So this was the beginning of a technique that then I've done a lot of different things with. But it began with the fault lines, the faults, I call them. And I would find these cracks, I would rub them, and then I would piece them together in ways that were not necessarily how I encountered them. So I could create these long meandering faults that were photographically true in terms of the detail of each individual panel, but fictional in terms of the overall shape. And that part of it was really exciting to me, that I could kind of make up what the actual form was. So these are just some process shots of creating larger installations for exhibitions or for a collector's home. This is a kind of a test run of a piece I was making for a collector's home, and then there it is installed in their home. After I make the prints, then they're toned with photographic toners, so mostly sepia and selenium, which is a chemical process that changes the silver into these other minerals and changes the color into these kind of like richer earth tones. I also work with gold toner and copper toner. This one is called Witness Mark, and it's about 44 feet. And so this is consistent with the work I was making prior to all of this period was in relation to the landscape. A lot of it was made on location at night, of course, because I use darkness. So kind of going out, using the world as my dark room and relating to the landscape in a way where I was trying to get the photographic materials to interact directly with the landscape rather than being mediated through a camera or a lens. But this really took that concept of imprint and of like a direct interaction between material and subject to, it made it that literal. I mean, they're literally pressing together. And I felt like that was an important aspect of the work. So once I worked out the technical aspects of this technique, then suddenly the world kind of opened up to me in this way of an awareness of texture and of sort of hidden information that is everywhere that we're actually not necessarily even perceiving through photography, but also through our eyes, which are, the camera is modeled after the eyeball and the way vision works, reflected light off of objects. So I suddenly became hyper aware of texture, and even went through a phase where I would sort of like touch everything all the time. But the next subject that I turned the technique to was these old tree stumps, which happened to be growing right next to these old battery buildings, because there used to be a lot of cypress trees, and during World War II, they were cut down to open up the sight lines for people, you know, watching for ships and planes and whatnot, because this place where I was making this work is right on the cliffs above the Pacific. So this is one of the early photographic rubbings of a tree stump. And essentially it's the same process. I'm doing it at night in darkness. I'm hand embossing the paper into the rings of the tree. And because, you know, stumps that have been out in the landscape and have weathered for a while, the grain has raised, the rings have raised because the soft tissue wears away. And so you get these beautiful patterns. Most of these first images I'm showing you are about 20 by 24 inches. So, you know, about this big, so fairly small. This is actually a tree from my backyard. And in some cases, I'm layering, I'm doing multiple, sort of the rubbing equivalent of multiple exposures, in that I'm layering the textures. That's cypress again. As is this cypress, and this is a cypress where the heart of it had kind of decayed and rotted out. And one of the things I really love about the form of these trees is that a tree has a kind, well, this body of work is called automatic earth, which comes from the Paul Simon song. But to me, what that kind of points to is these organisms that have a predetermined form kind of inside them, right? Like a blueprint that they're trying to follow as they build themselves, right? So a tree wants to grow in perfect concentric circles. That's kind of its plan. And anywhere, here I'll go back to this one as an example, anywhere where it deviates from those perfect concentric circles means that something happened, right? So that's where the story is. And I love the idea of the story of an organism being written into its physical body in the form of flaws or irregularity, imperfections. And I mean, that's a metaphor that could be applied to humans and to anything, but trees are a kind of very direct, literal example of it because of the deviations from that clear pattern. So anywhere that you see some kind of, I'm going to go back to this one, for instance. This is a redwood tree, a fairly young redwood tree, actually. Anywhere where you see some deviation from that perfect concentric circles, it means there was either, you know, a flood, a drought, an infestation of some kind, human intervention, or even just a shift in its space, because some trees like redwoods are very responsive to what's around them. So if another tree grows right next to it, they kind of wiggle to the side and you end up with these very wiggly exterior shapes. So I realize you might be wondering, what's the relationship to motherhood here? I realize this work is not about motherhood. Very little of my work is about motherhood in a direct sense. It's more that my ability to make the work and to find what was important to me to say in the work changed with motherhood. As time has gone on, I have actually brought some of those themes into the content of the work itself. And I'll show you a little bit of that today at the end of the talk. This is redwood trees layered, like mirrored. So as this work developed, you know, as with any of this kind of more experimental technical work, the process and the form of the work is often driven by the possibilities and limitations of the material. And that's, I would say, kind of my primary muse, is like following the leads of like, what can the material do and what can't it do? So in this case, doing these rubbings at night outside, absolutely works, but even on the darkest night, you can only have that photo paper out for maybe 9-10 minutes. It starts to fog and get exposed just from the starlight. So that was a limitation in how detailed the images could become. So around this time, I befriended some arborists and tree trimmers who would get in touch with me if they were cutting down something big or something interesting and give me a slab of it. And that way I could take, slab, like a thick slab. I could take it, a cross section of a tree, take it into my studio or into the darkroom and work on it in a much more focused, slow, detailed way. So this is a piece that's collaged with 4 pieces of paper, but it's very detailed. I've kind of traced into every single ring. And so this would take many, many hours to rub each piece. And that was only possible by bringing it into a controlled space. There's a detail shot of it. This is another 4-panel piece. This is one of my favorite trees. It's a 300-year-old incense cedar tree that was infested with beetles inside. So all those holes, or kind of craters, are made from beetles, and that's probably ultimately what killed it. And one of the things about this work also is that because I know when I started working with trees that were freshly cut down, and I know when they were cut down, I could count the rings and find out when they were kind of born, when the tree started growing. So these larger ones are each titled with the year that they were born. So this was born in 1717. And I know this talk is for people in London, so your relationship to time in that part of the world is different than ours in America. But in America, 1717 seems like really a long time ago. Very few things here have that kind of history the way they do in the old world. That's a cypress. And so just to be clear, these ones are much larger. Each panel is 20 by 24 inches. So the whole piece here is 39 by 46 inches. Here's some process shots from this work. I'll move that so you can see my daughter helping me on the upper right there, poking out the dead tissue from that tree. And when I get these slices of trees that are newly cut, I have to kind of weather them myself because they haven't been sitting in the landscape weathering. So the way I do that is by burning them and then scrubbing out the burnt tissue, which is a really cathartic and wonderful part of the process also. What is happening? Oh, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to move into the next body of work. This work is called Generation, and it's what I did for the last 2.5 or 3 years before the pandemic started. It's different in that it's working with material culture rather than with the landscape, but it's similar in a lot of other ways. It is made through the same technique in the sense that it is analog photo paper embossed into these textures. I wanted, though, to start working with something more fluid and have a little more control over the composition of a piece. Working with trees and with cracks, you're very tied to the actual shape of the thing. I don't have a lot of choice in how to compose those, right? And so I wanted to work both with something where I could play with the composition within the frame more, but also where there could be a sense of kind of an object being animated and having that kind of movement and flow to it. And I've always been interested in textiles, and I've done other work with them to some degree, but hadn't quite found the right technique for it. So I began making these. They're all embossed handmade textiles from the last 200 years. And you can use the hand embossing technique on textiles and actually get quite a lot of detail in a small space. But as you try to expand, you lose register constantly. So my solution to that was I started using a giant etching press. So the way that this work is made, and this piece is about, it's 42 by 75 inches. So that's it's pretty giant. It's over a meter tall and 7 feet long or something, 8 feet long, 6 feet. I don't know. My math skills aren't great. So what I'm doing is I'm working on an etching press in a completely darkened room. I black out the room, and in total darkness, I run the photo paper through the etching press with the textile and then peel them apart and then cast light onto the embossed photo paper and then hand develop it. And developing gelled and silver prints this large is quite a physical task. And so I have kind of my own made up techniques for doing that as well. I turned a little bathroom into a dark room, and I paint on the chemistry and wash it off and paint on the next one. And so that also adds to the kind of like texture and imperfections in the image. Helicopter. Okay, so in terms of the content here and the subjects that I'm choosing, like I said, they're all handmade textiles from the last 200 years. My criteria in choosing textiles was, I believe, about 3 factors. I was looking for things that were handmade and that had a huge amount of labor had been put into them. So things that were very detailed and intricate and someone had spent a lot of their life hours working on. And that someone is almost always a woman, because just if you look at kind of the global history of textiles, the vast majority of those traditions they're made by women. The next thing I was looking for is I was interested in, cultural appropriation, which of course is part of the process of what I'm doing, in that I'm using these objects from another culture, but I was interested in objects that already had that kind of appropriation or cross-cultural kind of pollination embedded in the object. So textiles that come from either one culture producing them for sale in a different culture, or they come from a culture where the style has been brought by immigrants who came from somewhere else, or kind of 2 different aesthetics blending into one. So that's actually, in the history of fashion, that's almost everything. It's very common. So that's really not that hard to find. But I was trying to find ones that had really stories of that kind of cross-cultural engagement embedded in the aesthetics of the object. And then the third thing, maybe my favorite thing, is finding objects that had imperfections, that had visible signs of wear. Basically similar to what I said about the trees. I'm looking for things where the life of the object has been written into its physical body. So whether that's, it's just, it's got kind of stray threads and holes worn through it from someone's body, or it's been altered and re-sewn, repaired, or, changed, added to, all those kinds of things. And I love that kind of visible mending that appears, and so much of that is actually more readable through texture than it is in any other way. Just to give you an example, this is a skirt, a traditional Mexican skirt called La China Poblana, and it's become kind of emblematic of Mexican culture. It's the kind of skirt that women wear in festivals and dance performances. Frida Kahlo popularized it as a kind of reference to traditional Mexico and indigenous cultures, but kind of brought it into this like 20th century style that she had. But what's interesting about it is this style actually comes, do I have a picture? Oh, there's a detail shot of it. It's covered in sequins, and the sequins are in a pattern of a eagle holding the snake in its mouth, which is, the emblem on the Mexican flag. But the style actually comes from Puebla and originated from one woman who was from India and was sold as a slave somehow to some kind of Mexican lord. This was in the 1600s, early 1600s, I believe, was brought to Mexico, ended up living in a convent in Puebla, and then somehow left there and ultimately married a kind of wealthy merchant, and became this sort of like character in town. Like, she became a lady, she became kind of known, and she was very, unique looking and had this particular unique way of dressing. And essentially what she was doing was she was taking her Bengali style and kind of using Mexican textiles, Mexican artisans to make these sort of styles, like, you know, a sequined sari, or those kind of the draped scarf across the shoulder, and then the skirt heavy with sequins. And that became this style known as La China Poblana, which is a Mexican style that, you know, derives from that. So to me, that's an incredible story of a kind of a whole fashion being seeded by one person's immigration and one person's story and aesthetic that they brought. So yeah, that's one example. A lot of these textiles have those kinds of stories. The way I approached this project is I would find a textile I wanted to work with, and then I would do research into where was it from, who made it, what did it mean to them, like what was its actual origin, and then also kind of what was its kind of like popular history, in the sense of like, how is it perceived? What do we associate it with? I do a lot of just Google image searches, just culling images from, you know, the kind of group mind of the internet. And so this is a collage of source images related to La China Poblana, the skirt I just showed you the piece of. And so learning about all of that informs the finished piece that I make. But I also wanted that research. And, you know, granted, it is a kind of a poetic form of research. I'm not a scholar, I'm an artist. But I wanted that research to be visible to the audience. So for this body of work, I also made this book, which has 6 essays that each go into the history and my engagement with 6 different textiles. And then they each include a collage of reference images related to that. And the covers of the books are made out of test strips and scraps from the making of the work. So the covers actually have the texture, and that's a way for people to engage with that, which was important to me because, of course, in a gallery or museum setting, you can't let people touch the artwork, but I really wanted people to have that tactile experience that I was having. This was another one that was about embroidery samplers. And you can see on the second page there, you can actually see the texture on the underside of the page. So now I'm going to move more quickly through this body of work, just to show you how it evolved over a few years of working on it. This one is a British textile that's about 200 years old. It's a panel from the front of a skirt. It's made on incredibly thin, beautiful muslin, and it's embroidered with ferns. And it was probably a panel that someone cut off, like a dress maybe got worn out, and so they cut that panel out to reuse, which I find that a lot. Things where parts are cut out or removed or resewn. This piece actually now belongs to the Victoria and Albert Museum. So maybe it will be on view there sometime. There's a detail of it. And the sort of slashes you see in that image are the folds of the photo paper itself. So the flaws of the paper kind of intersect with the fabric and become part of the same image. And I can't control that entirely, but I can encourage or discourage it. Let's put it that way. These are 2 pieces that are of nylon stockings from the 1950s and 60s, American made. This is a beautiful embroidery sampler. I believe it's Irish, but I'm not positive. Really mysterious. To me, this looks like petroglyphs. Someone got really creative with this one. There's a detail of it. This is one of my favorite types of garment to work with, the Mantón de Manila, which I showed you a big one of at first, otherwise known as a piano shawl or a flamenco shawl. They have so much energy and movement in them, and they have the wonderful story of being made in China for the European market, shipped via the Spanish galleons, you know, over several hundred years of back and forth. They were generally made in China, shipped through the Philippines, and then through Mexico, the Spanish galleons, they had to carry cargo across Mexico overland and then put it back on ships again. So every place that something passes through in that kind of migration of objects, there's an influence in the place. You know, things fall off the truck and end up in those places. And also there's a, you know, that place influences the things. So I like that that's kind of embedded in it. One of the interesting things about these shawls is that the actual silk scarf tends to deteriorate a lot quicker than the fringe does, which is also silk, but it's heavier silk. And so there's a lot of these, like this, like you see in this image, a fringe that doesn't have the scarf attached to it. And there's kind of a tradition of reuse with those, cutting them off when the scarf wears out, sewing them onto a new shawl, or even using the fringe, like in the 1920s when women would make their own flapper dresses. This is another Menton de Manila fringe. And at this point too, like in this image, I'm getting heavier handed with the toning. So to me, these ones feel a bit like storms, like a kind of tempest, and the kind of rosy tones in the background you're seeing are done with gold toner. This one's more selenium. There's a detail. I also allow my body to become part of the work and actually encourage it, because this work is so physical, because these pieces are so large. You know, working in total darkness with this giant etching press, cranking it, developing them in the darkness. Our fingerprints, mine and my studio assistant, our fingerprints get all over the work, and we've kind of decided to like just let that be part of it. And so when you look up close, you get these textures of that. So this is the last show I had right before I had my son in the fall. And it is the same body of work, but kind of the like next evolution of it from the previous shows. And in this show, I did include the book I had made, but I really wanted that kind of background research to come a little more foregrounded. And also this gallery that I'm represented by, Euqinom Gallery, is in San Francisco, and it's in my neighborhood in San Francisco. And so it was important to me, and my neighborhood is, you know, a largely Latino, largely working class, but kind of a mix of all different kinds of people. It's very multicultural, and you know, it's not, this gallery is kind of on its own there. It's not like in a fancy gallery zone. And so it was important to me to do something that was accessible to people just walking by on the street who aren't necessarily like fine art viewers seeking that out. And so I took a lot of images that were not about one specific textile, but images from research that were just all women making textiles, women making fabric from all different cultures and all different time periods since photography started documenting those things, and made this kind of photographic collage mural on the exterior of the building, so that as you approach, you see that, and then you can go inside and see the photographic reliefs and photographic rubbings that I had made. This mural is called Life Hours, and it was really kind of meant to be like an offering to the labor, to the kind of invisible labor of women making fabric, which, you know, that's different all over the world and through different time periods. There's different conditions, but there is something kind of archetypal about the act of weaving and of sewing and of mending. Yeah, so I wanted to bring that into it. I also was referencing the way that old photo albums, family photo albums, often have the pictures cut out and layered over each other in this sort of crude way. I really love that aesthetic, so that's in there too. And this was a temporary mural that was up for about 3 months for the duration of the show. And then this is the exhibition. So you can see some of the pieces I mentioned. This piece on the left is one of my favorites. It's called Faceless Immortals, and it's a Chinese, it's actually a panel from a wall tapestry from China, and the faces of all the figures have been removed. This is a really large one. This is like 8 feet by 8 feet, 2 panels. This is a tunic dress from the Swat Valley in Pakistan. There's a detail of it. And as you can see, the backgrounds in some of these have become really complex as well. And that's layers of shadows created with other things that cast shadows, like in this series, I used a lot of plants that grow in the region the textile's from to kind of cast the background shadows. So each one, when I say, you know, the light is cast across it to make the exposure, it's a little more complex than that. It's a lot of exposures. I mean, it's simple, but there's a lot of subtlety. So a piece like this, which is quite large, probably has about 9 exposures in it, but all made within a few minutes of each other. Just sort of like, you know, like a little dash of this, a splash of that from this side, from that side, you know, trying to kind of create the kind of shadows and light that I'm looking for. There's a detail of it. There's a detail of another one of those. And you can see the colors are getting more intense. I definitely, you know, I used to work in really vibrant colors, and the last several years I've worked with black and white, and I was craving color and trying to find subtle ways to weave it in there. This one is another one of those shawls, a really wild one, really large. This is the face panel, the niqab of a Afghani burqa from the 1970s. It's really beautifully embroidered. So it would go over the face, and that little kind of diamond shape is where a woman's eyes would look through, and then she would have a head covering over that connected to it. This was one of the hardest ones to find information about or images about, you know, for obvious kind of cultural reasons. But I was so in love with the object of this one that I kind of took a different approach, and I approached it as though I was making a portrait of a stranger, you know, which is such a photographic tradition in street photography. And yeah, tried to relate to it as like, if there was someone's face behind that and I'm making a portrait of them, what can I know or not know about them through relating to this intricate object, to this kind of screen. There's a detail of it. This one's actually really tiny. It's the only really small one. It's from a textile from Panama. There's another one of those. Sometimes I work with the same textile multiple times and make a few different images of it, but generally I can't do more than a few because the process actually can destroy the fabric. So some of them dissolve through this process, especially if they're silk. This is an Uzbeki tapestry from the 1960s. I really, really love working with things from Uzbekistan. Their textiles are just incredible. And this comes from a kind of a popular like folk image of the woman with the deer. It's repeated a lot. This one is Japanese made for the market of selling them to American servicemen, which I think is an interesting history. Okay, and that brings me up to the pandemic. I'm going a little long, so I'm going to try to do this quickly. But this is the work where I don't know that motherhood so much comes into the content of it exactly as into the process. So after I had the exhibition I just showed you, I had my son the next month, and that was in November of, last November. And then, I kind of was on maternity leave for about 4 months. And right when I was actually the week that I was going back to work, the COVID-19 shutdown happened here. And initially it was quite severe in San Francisco, where, it was don't leave your house, don't go to work, don't see anyone, don't do anything. And over time, as we all know, that has softened and there's been different stages of it. and we're still in it to a degree, but that initial period of like maybe the first 3 months were really like housebound. And I had, you know, a newborn baby and a very energetic 5-year-old at home. And so pretty quickly I realized, okay, I can't make my darkroom work. I can't work with my studio assistant, go to my studio building, all of that. I need to find a way to make work so that I don't lose my mind at home. And it needs to be something that I can kind of do like in the mix with my kids, because I, you know, have to. So I had all these handkerchiefs that I had purchased when I was collecting textiles for that other project, but I had never used them. I find handkerchiefs, previously anyways, I found handkerchiefs to be kind of too sentimental and dainty, and I'm not interested in anything dainty. I like making work that's kind of like big and messy and too much, you know? So I had steered away from them, but I had them here in my house, and I also had a lot of watercolor inks, which is a medium I used to work with when I was like a teenager. I don't know why I still had them, but I did. And so I began this process, and I had previously done some testing of inks to see how light fast they were for a different project. I was looking for something that wouldn't fade in the sun, but what I encountered was that this certain type of watercolor ink, well, several types of it actually, fade so quickly that I certainly couldn't trust them to be archival, but I also thought, wow, they fade so quickly, it's almost like a photographic medium. So what I began doing was this. That's the view from the outside of my apartment, and that's the view from the inside. Coating sheets of paper with these saturated colors of watercolor inks, and then exposing them to sunlight using handkerchiefs as the negative, so that's blocking the light. There's my kids, and there's my daughter's hand helping me do tests. So a lot of tests of how long does it take to fade, which colors fade more than others. And that is kind of the result that you get. This was an early one, but once I had it working, at first it just, you know, didn't work at all. There's always a long period for me with each project of kind of research and development, as I call it, to figure out, you know, how to use these materials. Because as you can see, I tend to take an existing material and use it for something that is not what it was intended to be used for. And I find that to be a super generative way to work. Most materials in the world have, or art materials have, you know, are designed to do one thing, but actually have other things that they can do. And it's sort of like a riddle to try to figure out what those other things are. And as I go, there's always kind of a, you know, technical things I realized that then steer the process. So one of the earliest things I realized with this was white fabric does not block sunlight very well. So I started dyeing the handkerchiefs black. And that was a way to make it be a little more opaque and therefore make a clearer image. So that was like, there was a practical reason to do that. Once I did it, I kind of fell in love with the process of dyeing them black and the way that that felt like this kind of mourning ritual. And, you know, traditionally when people would mourn, they would dye a bunch of their clothes black and wear that for a period of time. It became part of the content. And of course, handkerchiefs, which had previously been not as interesting to me, suddenly became interesting because of the pandemic. Because, you know, handkerchiefs are this very intimate object. I mean, really, it's just this small piece of fabric, but it's this very intimate object that traditionally is totally related to health and personal hygiene. And if you're working with vintage antique handkerchiefs like I was, they, you know, they actually have all been used. And so they've absorbed people's snot and sweat and tears. And then I was also interested in the fact that the handkerchief has this relationship to health and to illness, but it also is a symbol of compassion. You know, we would never do this now, but in the old days, someone would offer a handkerchief as a sign of, as a way to comfort someone else who was suffering. And so they suddenly became quite loaded. And a lot of the handkerchiefs I was working with too were old enough that they had actually lived through the Spanish flu of 1918. which I thought was interesting. Like, what experience or knowledge or some kind of, I don't know, something is embedded in these objects that have made it through a global pandemic already. So it sort of started as this like brief thing, you know, at the time, like everyone, I thought we'd be in quarantine for like a month and I would do this a little bit. Now it's turned in, it started as like a side project, and now it's kind of turned into my primary work right now. And it's grown. I also started to make them as individual images. That's how I imagined them. Now I'm working on making them into a very large installation that is actually going to be on view in the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art in December, hopefully, if all goes as planned. And that will be an installation of the prints as well as of a wall of the actual handkerchiefs, kind of installed more sculpturally. So this is my daughter. The next step was I realized that the window was working, but it was vertical. And if I made the relationship to the sun a perpendicular relationship, they would expose much faster and have a crisper image. So we moved the operation to the roof of our apartment, and it's very exciting for my daughter to be able to go on the roof with me. There's San Francisco in the background. So you can see the images were kind of changing. This was the first one that I accidentally dripped some water onto after coating it, and it left this sort of blooming stain, which to me seemed related to all the kind of bodily fluids and stains on the handkerchiefs. And so I just went deep into working with those kinds of stains. Eventually, at some point in the process, I was able to, you know, lockdown was loosening up, and I was losing my mind, being at home with the kids all the time and having no space of my own, you know, coating these on the kitchen table. So eventually I did go back to my studio for the painting part of it. But where I'm at currently is I go to my studio to work on that part of it, but the exposures are all still happening here at the apartment on my roof. These are some of the images. That's the image on the left is looking down into our backyard. We share our backyard with the family downstairs, and that's handkerchiefs drying after they've been dyed black. Oh, this is a little video just so you can have a sense. So bringing in the motherhood part of it, obviously I was having to integrate my kids into this. And it was changing the work. I mean, this work felt initially kind of diminutive compared to what I usually make, but it also was like loosening it up in this way and allowing it to be playful. My daughter's opinion is often expressed, and I take it seriously, you know. So here's a little clip of, it's rainy today. We woke up with it rainy. And so I moved these in off the deck. I'm hoping they didn't get too much water seeping in the corners and that they'll be okay. And I'll put them back out tomorrow once it's sunny. And they're now covering our bedroom floor, along with these people. So just a little dose of reality there. And, you know, it's equally charming and infuriating to work in this way. I'm trying to think what else to say about that in this regard. Yeah. You know, I think a lot about how my kids will see me when they're older. And I hope that looking back on things like this will be meaningful to them. You know, I think now it's a lot like, oh, mom and her handkerchiefs, like, why is she always getting handkerchiefs? But I think that in the long run, they'll look back, and the fact that they were involved in my art practice, I think will probably be really valuable to them. So at least that's what I hope. Here's another quick little video, just kind of, this is the funnest part of making this work, is what we call the reveal, when, you know, after it's been exposed for several weeks, when I lift them off and you get to see what you got, because you really can't tell while you're making it. You know, like so much of my work, it's kind of working blind, and then, and there's a lot of risk and a lot of failure in it. You know, a lot of them are just don't work at all or are really ugly, and then there's a great thrill and satisfaction when they do work. So there's a few. So where I'm at now on this is moving from making them as individual images into working on the large installation. And the installation I'm putting together right now that I mentioned for SFMOMA will be a grid of 140 of the prints, and then a wall almost as big, not quite as big, of the handkerchiefs. And I've really come to like love the objects. They, you know, when I'm dyeing them, I started out with like the 20 handkerchiefs I happen to have. Now I've collected a lot more. I buy them on eBay mostly in these large batches from different eras. But as I noticed, as I was working on it, you know, dyeing them, drying them, they would be like this kind of flock of crows or of bats or something that would sort of drift about my house and settle in different spots. And they had such a heavy feeling to them. It felt like they were kind of the mirror image of these bright, colorful images I was making. And as the kind of body of work grew, I came to see each image as kind of an individual in a crowd, and, you know, representing this colossal loss that we've had globally, but particularly here in America during this pandemic. And particularly also, you know, like so many of us, I think I've become kind of dependent on these daily statistics of each day checking the charts and the graphs and where are the hot spots and what's the death rate here and the death rate there. And that's become a kind of daily ritual. But I'm very conscious of the conflict of trying to perceive human experience through statistics. And so as I'm working on this installation that's going to be in a corner, so it's sort of mirrored, maybe I have pictures of it, I'm working on, I'm thinking about kind of the grid as this, you know, very kind of mathematical representation of this experience, and then the wall of handkerchiefs as this very like fluid, flawed human version of that same experience. And as I work with these, the fabric itself becomes more and more kind of corporeal and imperfect. First being dyed black and then being put out in the sun, they fade a lot. So in addition to the photograms I'm making with the ink, there's kind of another photogram happening on the fabric. So you can see some of these have these like light and dark kind of angles and shapes and streaks. That's actually the sun fading the fabric while it's making the exposure onto the paper. And I love that part of it. Yeah. I'm just starting to talk about this work publicly because obviously it's very much still in process. One of the things I did do differently though with this project that I should mention is I normally don't share that much about my process, at least until the work is finished. With this work, from the very beginning, from the moment I started it, I documented behind the scenes everything, and I was posting and writing about it all on a kind of process blog or process journal on my website and on Instagram. And that was very new to me, but I felt like, you know, we're all shut in somewhere. These are really simple materials. They're not rarefied. They're things that lots of people could get if other people want to try this technique. And so I felt like it called for a kind of generosity during this time when we were all so separate. And that's been really different and really, really fun for me, and a way to, you know, engage with people in different parts of the world who feel connected to it. So that's kind of changed the way I share about the work as well. So yeah, that's, you know, working on the grid. Here's kind of what it's looking like. And we are just at 1 hour, so I am gonna stop. This is just a list of artists that are, many of these are local Bay Area artists. Some are obviously much more well known, but these are all, oh, I forgot to put that guy's last name in. These are all artists making work about motherhood that I'm interested in. So that one that says Vanessa Woods and Josh, that's actually a couple who's making work together, and I just couldn't remember his last name. They just had a show here though that was interesting about parenting, and that came into the work. So these are people whose work probably is a little more directly engaged with the intersection of motherhood and creative practice. And yeah, I just encourage you to take a screenshot or something if you want to look any of them up. This is my info if you want to find out more about my work, my website, my Instagram, where I share a lot of process, and then
Hi there. I hope you can hear me. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you for staying and for listening. If you have any questions, obviously Klea cannot be with us because she's in the US. But if you have any observations or anything, you can pop it in the chat, or you can ask directly, turning on your video and microphone. I hope that each of you found something interesting or relevant in this video, and it's going to be available on UIR website. So if you missed something, or you would like to rewatch it, or you would like to share, do please have a look. Hopefully it's going to be online next week. Thank you again for coming, and have a lovely weekend. There are no questions. So,
hi, Liz, kind of quickly.
Oh, yes. Hi,
Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say the whole time I was like, wow, about her process and the work is like stunning. And also I was wondering about you, because obviously you're a mother and that's why you invited her to speak. So I was wondering if you feel the same way about your work before and after. Do you feel like there's a divide? Because I haven't seen your work actually before. From before you were a mother, so I'm wondering if you feel like your work is really different or if it's kind of blending into it.
Yes, it's a very interesting question, and thank you. Yes, I have to admit that sort of even starting my MA, because obviously we are talking about now this is a celebration of our MA graduate. So I have started my MA because I started to work again and think about art and think about more visually once I had my daughter, which was 4 years ago, which seems a long time. But I definitely think that there is a shift, is something, it just puts your life under more like a like just blows up everything, all your ideas or all your feelings you just become more aware, you become aware of time. So yes, and Klea's work somehow came as an aid during pandemic, and this is the other thing which I think is amazing of her work and her practice, how how much she shares of her process and her feelings and her ideas. So I think she was one of the person which, you know, made me think during pandemic, well, you can do it. There is no, you might be in the house, in a small house or bigger house with your family, but you can still be creative, and just really have to look around and find your ways around. So yes.
Are you following her? Were you watching her process during the pandemic then on social
yes,
media?
it's very interesting. Yes, as when the pandemic started, what I've done, I wrote a list with all the things I've had, and then I just started to Google, like, you know, what alternative printmaking, alternative photography. And when I Googled alternative photography, one of her works popped up. So then I started to research her, and then that led me to more to learn about her process and her artworks.
Yeah, such an interesting process, by the way. Like,
Yes,
so
yes,
interesting to
it's
hear about it.
amazing, and it's amazing how she uses so many objects and the medium itself, and somehow gives a new life. Yeah. So
And also, sorry, I want to ask
yeah,
as
yeah,
well.
no.
Did you involve your daughter in your process at all? Would you say during lockdown?
In my process, well, I photographed my daughter a lot, and I didn't really, and that was another thing. I've done a few of these photograms myself, but unfortunately, because it was towards the end of my MA, I had so much to write. So I was quite sad that I couldn't produce as much as I wished. But I did make a lot of photographs, and somehow this distance, it was more bearable in a way, that I could be really close to my family and photograph them and just see them every day. And now as I look back to these images, I just see how much we changed. Yeah, so
yeah, interesting.
thank you.
Hi Elise, I have
Hi,
a kind of question tapping into that of being at home and making work, because I know that you make work about like separation, or at least you did before lockdown, and I was just wondering how the lockdown kind of affected that. Do you feel like you still are interested in the kind of like motherhood separation between like going away, because I'm assuming that's what it is, like going away from your child, or like the whole separation thing? And I was just wondering if that has changed or shifted the focus slightly.
Yes, that's very interesting. Thank you for asking. Somehow, and it's just, my daughter only started school 3 weeks ago, but somehow I felt that because I spent with her so much time during the lockdown, I sort of made up all the lost, you know, those lost time, for what I felt really bad, like going for my MA and doing my MA and doing my art, and just every time leaving her and she begging me like, oh, come stay. And now I was at home with her, and then this also links to, yeah, exactly what I told to Nicole, that I started to make more images with her, or about her presence in the domestic place, and somehow incorporated her. And it's just a continuous shift. And I started just, my subject matter and my work started to shift into this, about being her. But yeah, it's very interesting. It's still is a work in progress, and but interestingly, I started not to feel that bad about being away or doing my own things, because she just becomes such a independent person herself, and it's very interesting to capture her everydays. And yeah, I don't know if it makes sense at all.
Yeah, I think it does. Do you think like, because I guess now that you've spent so much time with her and she goes to school, that might be like almost a bit of a relief because you get a bit more time. But do you feel like it will go back to how it was before, or is it kind of like a new thing now?
I think it won't go back because I started to be interested in different subjects, and even within my photography or my image making, I just started to shift, and I have other subjects, and it's very interesting. It started to shift from motherhood, my own subject as well, while the pandemic happened, and I started to be more aware of different ideas of family. I am still, my subject is still rooted in the family, but I am looking now at the wider concept of being in a family, or identity within a family, or working with archive and going back more to my own childhood, and working with with photographs taken of me when I was a child. So so I think that this is the next level in my artistic practice and in my motherhood, when I will have to learn to let go her, and to be her own self, and to develop her own personality. And then parallel to that, I am looking to my own identity and where this one takes me.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because obviously, you know, as artists, our personal life is really often, I guess, linked to our artistic practice.
Yes, exactly.
So yeah, I think it's really interesting to talk about motherhood and artistic practice together.
Yeah, thank you. And Rachel she asked me if I collaborated with her and let her take over your daily photographic project. Frida, yes. So what Frida does, Frida is my daughter, and sometimes she would get she found my phone, and she knows how to unlock and just make photographs. So she started to make digital photographs, not with my analog camera, but with the digital herself. And sometimes I just like to post these ones on my Instagram. My Instagram right now, it's called is a visual diary, and I started exactly on the day when lockdown started, on the 23rd of March, and I would post an image every day. First, it was a way of coping with what is going on, and I wanted my artistic practice to keep going. I didn't really want to stop, and it felt in a way that is a focus of taking an image, a digital image. So, but I am also thinking of how could I incorporate her even more, like her marks in my artwork. But this is a completely different project, and it's just, it has a little seed, but it has to still grow as we all grow. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming and listening to this artist talk, and listening to me and asking all the questions. And I wish a wonderful weekend